SEMC's July virtual program, Confessions from the Security Vault. Thank you all for joining us today. For those who may be new to SEMC, we are a regional professional organization representing museums and museum staff across the 12 southeastern states, as well as the U.S. Virgin Islands and Puerto Rico. We have a strong membership of over 2,000 and continue to grow. If you're not currently a member, please consider joining SEMC, where access to virtual programs is always free with your membership. Before we begin today's program, I would like to acknowledge and thank ArtSentry for their sponsorship of the program. Additionally, the National Museum of African American History and Culture, Office of Strategic Partnerships, has also provided significant support for all of our 2026 virtual programs. These partnerships help SEMC keep all of our programs free or low cost. Today, we're pleased to continue our virtual series with a program that explores common vulnerabilities museums overlook, real-world security failures, and the growing challenges institutions of all sizes face today. Presenters will discuss emerging threats, future trends, and practical strategies for strengthening preparedness without sacrificing openness or visitor experience. I hope all of you will participate in this conversation with Carrie and Tim, who each bring unique experience to a topic that is probably not discussed enough. Professional development is a year-round endeavor for SEMC, and we appreciate everyone's commitment to both present and to attend. Now it's my pleasure to introduce Heather Nowak, SEMC's Program Administrator, to review some session housekeeping information before we begin the discussion.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name is Heather Nowak, and I'm the Program Administrator for the Southeastern Museums Conference. And before getting started, I'll quickly cover a few housekeeping items. We are in a meeting format today, so I encourage you to keep your computer muted for now. We will have time later for questions and discussion, but in the meantime, utilize the chat, introduce yourself, and share information, ask questions. If you need closed captioning, it is available. Click the CC button in your Zoom screen and enable the auto transcription feature. You can also download a full transcript by clicking More at the bottom of your Zoom screen and then click the transcript button. The program today is being recorded and will be emailed to each of you by the end of the week. At the end of the program, I'll share a short 2-minute survey, and these surveys help us with future programming. So please fill it out, tell us how we did today, and what you would like to see in the future. I would also like to take a moment to mention that registration for SEMC 2026 in Winston-Salem, North Carolina is now open. Early bird registration ends on July 31st, so do not delay. You only have a few more weeks to get the best rates. We will be hosting a virtual Know Before You Go informational session about the conference on September 8th. So if you're new to the conference or want to know all of the details ahead of time, be sure to join us for that. You can visit our virtual programs page to find out more and to see what we have in store for the remainder of 2026. We have a fantastic conversation in store today, so let's get started. It's my pleasure to introduce our panelists. Joining us is Carrie Heflin, Regional Sales Manager at ArtSentry. And again, thanks to ArtSentry for sponsoring this program. And also joining us is Tim Carpenter, Managing Director at Argus Cultural Property Consultants and former FBI crimes team member, who I'm sure has some fantastic and interesting stories to tell. We can't wait to hear from the two of you today about museum security and what's in store for the future. Carrie, I'll turn it over to you to get us started.
Thank you, Heather. Thank you, Zinnia. It's such a treat to be here today with everyone, and it's great to see lots of familiar faces as well as many new ones in our audience. So thank you all for taking time to spend with us during what I'm sure is a busy Tuesday. I'm going to go ahead and throw some slides up on screen that we're going to use just to kind of guide the conversation. But as Heather mentioned, we would love to keep this kind of an open flowing conversation between us and you. So as we move through the slides, please don't feel like you can't throw up a hand or unmute and come in with a question at any point. We welcome that. I'm going to move over to our introduction slide. And because I am a true gentle lady, I'm going to offer Tim the opportunity to introduce himself first. Good morning, Tim.
Hey, good morning. Thanks, Carrie. Likewise, thanks to Heather and Zinnia and SMC for having us on today. And of course, thanks to ArtSentry and you, Carrie, for a great partnership as always. We're happy to be here and talk about my favorite topic, which is art crime. Heather did a great job of introducing me. I'm the managing director of Argus Cultural Property Consultants. And most of you probably know me from my previous life, and that was with the FBI's art crime team. So where I was not only an investigator with the team for a number of years, but I also ran that program, was the head of the team there in Washington, D.C. for a number of years. Great privilege to be part of that program. And Heather's right. We have a lot of funny stories, a lot of cool stories. We love to talk about art crime, but more importantly, we like to educate and try to prevent these types of incidents from happening. So hopefully we can share some insights for you all today.
Yeah, absolutely. Sitting anywhere where I get to hear Tim's stories is always my favorite place to be. So y'all are in for a treat. As you already know, I'm Carrie. I work with a company called ArtSentry, where I am our sales manager. And we're going to tell you just a little bit more about what Tim and I respectively do now. Tim just shared that he was with the FBI for a number of years. Before I came to my current role, I was with the Smithsonian for about a decade as a frontline worker myself, visitor experience and education. So I definitely bring a lot of that background into everything I do now, but what we do now is a little different. So we wanted to just tell you, what are Argus and ArtSentry so you can understand kind of where we're coming from in this conversation. Tim, tell us just a little bit about Argus, please.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Carrie. We started Argus really just because we wanted to keep the band together, I think is what I tell most folks, right? Uh, what made us successful with the FBI's art crime team and the art crime program was not just the organic expertise and skills that we developed in that program and the team, but it was really our partnerships and working with the community writ large. So whether it was the museum industry, other law enforcement agencies, our foreign partners, uh, that's what made us really successful. And so that was my vision, leaving government service. I wasn't really quite ready to hang that up yet. So we tried to replicate that model with Argus. And so what we've done is we've built a really strong bench of all of these disparate and various skill sets. And we brought folks in that were, prior State Department, prior Department of Justice. We've got some FBI art crime folks. We've got some private sector people. And so really trying to build that strength of bench. And we just want to continue to do what we've always done. We want to get out and be of help to the cultural heritage community in any way that we can, and be that the museum community, or if it's private collectors, foreign governments, the U.S. government. We do training. We do a lot of risk assessments, risk management type work, and just general consulting in the art space.
Yeah, and just to reiterate what you were saying, Tim, about keeping the band together, Argus really is one of the most interesting groups of people I've ever had the pleasure of working with. So if y'all are looking for consultants, not only are they, the top of their professional game and really able to give you some powerful insights into how to better secure not only your property, but your assets and your staff. But they're also just really fun people to get to know. They have amazing depth of experience in their respective fields that they bring to the table. And at ArtSentry, we are where you go when you're done with Tim's part, with the evaluation or the audit or the master planning, and you're ready for implementation. We specialize in surveillance and object protection. So we actually make a proprietary software that alarms off of cameras and gallery spaces, and basically is designed to let you know when people are getting too close to the stuff you don't want them to touch, which is a lot of things in museums. So that's enough about us. We know you came here today to get the tea, to get the inside scoop on art crime and museum security, and we won't keep you waiting any longer. We're going to use a framework of just sort of walking through some real world events that have taken place over the last couple of years that speak to the different subject areas that we're trying to cover. And with each of those, I'm going to kind of tee up the event, and then we're going to get what I like to call Tim's take on it, where Tim shares a little bit about some of his observations and insights about that incident based on his experience and his work now with Argus. Tim didn't know that I called him Tim's Takes, so he hasn't had a chance to trademark that yet. I got to get on it, start making the hats. So to kick us off, I think this will be a familiar image to most people. The Palisades fire caused incredible damage to the LA community back in January of 2025. And one of the many areas that was put at risk by that event was the Getty Villa. And the Getty, based on where it's located, is actually incredibly well prepared when it comes to fire prevention, fire detection, and handling fire emergencies, more so than I would think most museums are. So they were very well prepared to meet this incident, and still it posed really significant risk to their site, their collections, their staff, and their visitors, and they were forced to close for a period of time. So Tim, what I'd like to hear from you is a little bit maybe about your reaction to this event specifically, but also more broadly to the way that museums are having to adjust their planning and their operations to meet the challenge of climate-related emergencies as we continue to see those really increasing in frequency and severity around the world.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Carrie. Look, I think we were all riveted by this and terrified all at the same time as we watched this event unfold. Of course, we've had a long-standing relationship with the folks out at the Getty, not only with Argus, but with the FBI's art crime team. Enjoy a really fantastic relationship there. We've done our annual art crime team training at the Villa before, and so tragic to see something like this unfold, particularly for an institution where we have a really close relationship. But we weren't super concerned because, as you suggested, Carrie, they were on top of things. This wasn't the first time that they had a fire encroach the property. And so they were able to learn from those past events. And that's crucial when you're building out brand new or you're updating your emergency contingency plans. And so the Getty had effective planning in place. So not only had they developed this effective planning for how they would respond to an incident like this, but they had developed those relationships with their local first responders, with fire, EMS, and police in advance. And that's super critical. We always talk about this when we're responding to crisis or critical incidents. That's not the time that you want to first meet your battalion commanders or your police captains, right? You should have those relationships in place in advance. You should have relationships in place with fine art movers, with the FBI's art crime team, all of these folks that you might need to call on in a moment's notice to come in and help you. Fires move fast, and it really is a triage moment when you're trying to decide what to do with the collection. Do you evacuate the collection, shelter in place? There's all kinds of things that you need to be considering. And so, ask for help in advance.
Yeah, I love that advice because it's tapping into a community resource that's already available. We try as often as possible to give guidance and tips for improving your security that aren't going to cost you extra money, because we know budgets are limited and you have to target those funds and how they get spent. So reaching out and introducing yourself, if you haven't already, to local first responders is a great way to start thinking about how you can integrate with their operations in emergency situations. And Tim, I think you'd probably agree with me that, as we continue to see climate change impacting weather patterns, around the world, this is something that, if you haven't already thought about it at your museum, needs to be top of mind.
Sure, we see this, and there's always loss. And, sometimes it's unpreventable. Most of the time, it's preventable loss. At the same time that we saw the fires developing in LA, of course, we had the hurricanes sweeping through Florida and the southern coastal areas. And quite a bit of loss occurred, not only institutionally, but through private collections and so forth. And so having those plans in place and being able to execute the plans is critical and will help people save their collections.
Absolutely. Let's take a look at our next event, and this one shouldn't come as a surprise to anybody. I don't think that we would get very good reviews on this webinar if we didn't talk at all about the Louvre, since that has been such a prominent player in this conversation over the last year. So I know I don't have to give a big introduction to this, but just to remind everyone of the details around the event. This took place in October of 2025 at the Louvre in Paris, when a team of amateur thieves, it turns out, broke into one of the galleries using a ladder truck from outside the museum, and in under 3 minutes was able to take about 80 million euro worth of valuable jewels from the museum's collection and make off with them. And they did this by exploiting some vulnerabilities in the museum's existing security system, which raised a lot of questions with other museums and with governments around the world about what the responsibility is of government entities and museums in their respective countries to make sure that those systems are keeping up with modern times and really safeguarding the assets under their protection. And I think it's a nuanced conversation that a lot of people tried to paint with a broad brush and just say, oh, the Louvre wasn't doing a good job and that's why this happened to them. But all of us in the museum industry know it's a lot more complicated than that. And Tim personally has been asked to weigh in on this topic many, many times. So I will just ask him to give us kind of the spark notes of, what were your reactions to this event and what are some of your takeaways about how museums can be better preparing against these types of threats?
Yeah, thanks, Karen. You're right. I've spoken an awful lot about the Louvre. Many of you have probably seen I did something around 60 media interviews in the immediate aftermath of this incident. And so I'm going to talk about the Louvre and I'll address all of that for you, but I'll start by just saying, for the last 20 years, no matter where I go and I lecture about art crime and I'm talking about the great work that the FBI's team had done and the work that we're doing in Argus, inevitably the one question I get everywhere I go is about the Gardner heist. Until now. And so I think the Louvre has kind of knocked that out a little bit. My partner, Jeff Kelly, who just wrote a book about the Gardner, it's a fantastic book. I have to tease him all the time that he's got some competition now to talk about. But on to the Louvre, right? People would ask how surprised we were about the event. Of course, in the press, everybody was shocked, and there was a lot of sensationalism about the heist. But I think for those of us that work art crime investigations for a living, we just kind of shrugged and said, yeah, it was bound to happen. And not really two things, because it was the Louvre and not just because it was the Louvre, if that makes sense. I often talk about it in this term. Having real actual security in a museum is nigh impossible. And before everybody starts, overreacting on that statement, I want you to consider this. If I asked you to secure $1 billion worth of any commodity, let's say gold, and I tasked you with securing $1 billion worth of gold, most of you are going to have some idea about what that looks like, and it's probably going to involve heavily fortified spaces. Maybe it's in a vault. It's going to be underground. You're going to have heavily armed security, sensor packages, barbed wire fence, all of these things that come to mind. And then I'm going to tell you, okay, secure that $1 billion worth of gold, and you can't have any of that. And you have to give the public access to interact with that $1 billion gold. Now, how do you do it? That really changes the conversation quite a bit. And so when the Louvre heist happened, there was a lot of negative kind of vitriolic stuff being thrown at the Louvre, like they had made a lot of mistakes. And they made some mistakes, but they made the same mistakes that every other institution makes. The reality is a dedicated group of criminals that are motivated, they're going to find a way to exploit your vulnerabilities. You can't prevent any of these, all of these incidents from happening short of securing these things in the vault. So were we surprised? Not terribly surprised. We've seen a massive shift in the last 6 to 7 years, particularly in Europe, where thieves are no longer targeting fine art, the traditional fine art, two-dimensional pieces, paintings, and those kinds of things that we historically have seen. They're moving to jewelry, gemstones, precious metals, because it's much easier for them to move those into the commodities market. We've been warning museums for some time that they need to pay particular attention to these types of collection materials. So if you have gold, silver, precious metals, gemstones, jewelry out on display, you really should be thinking about how you do that, where those are located in your facility, and then layering that security. Were there mistakes made at the Louvre? Of course, but they weren't necessarily unusual mistakes that we don't see in other institutions. And the other thing that I kind of chuckled when this heist occurred was a lot of that sensational language about how sophisticated an attack this was. And I think maybe I was the only person on the media saying that's not really accurate. This wasn't a terribly sophisticated crime. These guys were low-level criminals, street criminals. They just did their homework and they exploited a known vulnerability. But let's face it, this was just a brute force attack that got in with angle grinders. That type of attack can occur at any facility. And so that's part of that pre-planning, part of understanding where your actual threats lie. And we'll spend a bit more time talking about that, but I don't want to just spend the whole hour talking about the Louvre heist. So I'll take specific questions on that, but we want to visit some of these topics along the way.
Yeah, we definitely have some other heists to review. But before we leave this one, I'll just, share one of my insights, and I'd be interested in your take on it, Tim, which is, like you said, there's no 100% way to prevent this type of incident at an institution that has to balance collection security and collection access the way that museums are asked to do. But one of the things that I know got talked about a lot was the museum's outdated security systems and then some gaps in coverage. And while that might still not have prevented someone from coming in with angle grinders and breaking into those cases, I do think that having more robust technology and making sure that there weren't those coverage gaps could have helped a little bit with the investigation portion. Because that was another piece there where it took a really long time to kind of move anywhere on that because there just wasn't evidence available.
So it's an excellent point, Gary. Thanks for raising it. There's a couple of things we can unpack in there, right? So reliance on outdated technology. We tend to see that quite a bit more in our European markets, some in domestic in the United States, but that tends to be for smaller and medium-sized institutions. Most of our larger institutions have gone through technology upgrades to some extent. We still find problems, and we still find, as you suggest, gaps in camera coverage and sensor coverage and these types of things. And we want to make those improvements. Right, globally. We want every institution to be paying attention. We kind of thought that the Louvre would serve as a wake-up call for institutions. And I think what we've seen is really, kind of the meerkat thing where people poked their head up for a minute, they paid attention, and then it became old news and back to business as usual. So we hope that there are some lessons to be learned for conducting quality assessments of your vulnerabilities and your coverage areas and employing the right technology in those areas. But, technology alone doesn't prevent, criminal action. I don't know that a camera has ever stopped a subject from stealing anything before, right? So cameras are, as you suggest, Gary, they're investigative tools, first off. Now, where that model changes is when we start to use AI analytics with the camera. That changes that discussion quite a bit, where it's no longer just passively recording and it becomes an investigative tool. Now we can use the new emerging AI technologies to alert security staff that there's a problem developing, to give them that precious time that they need to respond and hopefully, mitigate the issue.
Yeah, and I know Xenia gave us a little sneak peek earlier that AI analytics was going to be one of the topics covered at the director's luncheon at this year's conference. So sorry if that's spilling the beans, Xenia, but I just want everyone to know if you're a director and you're not already signed up for the luncheon and that topic interests you, please sign up. And if you're not a director, tell your director to sign up.
Thank you, Carrie, for that plug.
Absolutely. All right, we'll move on from the Louvre. I promise we've got other things to talk about. And just because I remember Tim saying, we are seeing by and large a shift away from taking paintings and other fine art objects toward jewels and precious metals because they are easier to move on the black market. Just because he said that, I'm going to throw in an incident where someone took paintings, because that is still happening sometimes. So we want to talk about both, even though there's a trend away from that. This event took place in December of 2025 in Sao Paulo, and you might remember seeing it in the news because, like the Louvre, it was a robbery that happened in broad daylight, which was quite alarming to see. Thieves just walked in through the front door and took a whole cache of art, including several Matisse paintings, which is one of the reasons it's made such a big headline. And Tim, I'd love to hear from you, your reaction, not just to the incident itself, but also to the investigation, which seemed to move quite quickly in comparison. Were there some missteps that the thieves made there that maybe made it easier to apprehend them?
Yeah. So first, I'm going to comment on what you said about this daytime heist. In reality, most art heists are daytime heists, right? You just have the rare few examples, the Gardner being one that were carried out overnight. But most of our large-scale museum heists, whether domestically or internationally, actually are daytime heists. Thieves, these organized crime groups that target museums, like to exploit the chaos. Right? They're exploiting the fact that the staff are occupied and distracted with visitors, with operational issues that are going on. It's more risky for these criminal organizations to try to attempt entry in these institutions at night because none of that's going on, right? So if you get attention, you're getting everybody's focused attention. And so they like to do daytime robberies or daytime thefts. So that piece of it's not super unusual for us. But yeah, the speed of this investigation was notable. And I'm going to go back to the Louvre just a little bit. We see this oftentimes. These are not, it's not the Thomas Crown affair. That's not reality, right? These organized groups that target museums and target artwork, they specialize it in a sense, but they're not Thomas Crown. They make mistakes. The guys at the Louvre are just low-level street criminals, and they made quite a few mistakes. Same thing in Sao Paulo. When they make these mistakes and they leave behind forensic evidence, that's where teams like ours come in and we exploit that evidence and we can move pretty quickly. Technology is improving. It's making it a bit easier for the criminals to do their work, but it's also making it a bit easier for law enforcement to trace those criminals, right? Whether we're doing geofencing and we're looking at, pulling everybody's phones and we're doing all kinds of technical work. And I suspect that's what started happening immediately with this heist is they kind of, they dropped a geofence around that facility and immediately started to exploit all that data.
Yeah, and I love that you brought up the Thomas Crown affair because that's probably the number one thing I get asked when I tell people what I do for work is whether or not we do those cool moving lasers that you have to do gymnastics to get through. And of course, we don't do that. Lasers are not really effective for that type of object protection. But we love that so many people think that because that means they don't know what we're actually doing. And maybe we've got a leg up on them. So if you hear people spreading that information, feel free to lean in.
Right. Yeah. Misinformation is good in that way.
Exactly. I'm going to pivot us away from heists that happened to something rather unusual, which was a hypothetical heist that didn't happen. And this incident actually takes us to the topic of cybersecurity. So as we're talking about technology and AI and all of that, we wanted to make sure to fold this into the conversation. This took place earlier this year at the Uffizi Gallery in Florence. And the reported incident initially was that hackers had managed to access the Uffizi's internal network by exploiting vulnerabilities in an outdated operating system on one of their system servers. Not even a security system, but a collection management system, I believe, is what was running on that server. And it was one of those things that they'd gotten at some point and used and maybe weren't using as much anymore and hadn't paid attention to updating the operating system on it, which left it vulnerable to folks from the outside to access it. And the initial story that came out was that the hackers had managed to use that access to get all the information they needed about the Uffizi's security systems in order to just basically walk through the front door and rob them blind. And that they submitted a ransom note to the Uffizi telling them that and demanding money in exchange for not robbing them. The Uffizi later came out and said that's not quite true. They did gain access to some systems, but their security network is completely closed. So they didn't have access to that security, all of that security information, and we're kind of fronting a little bit in their ransom note. Now, the truth might lie somewhere between the two. We'll probably never know, but I think this does bring up this really important conversation about, how do we, once we bring technology into our spaces, do we become responsible custodians of those systems to make sure that we're not opening ourselves up to additional threats just by not keeping up, maybe with an operating system update.
Yeah, so look, I think this is going to be yet another emerging trend, particularly in Europe. Again, just like with the theft of precious metals, gemstones, and the like, this is an emerging crime trend. We've not seen it develop in the United States yet, but I promise it's coming. There have been some minor incidents that have occurred here over the years, but this is going to be a trend that criminal groups exploit. And so, I think we do a lot of assessments for institutions, and we often talk to them about their infosec, their information security posture, the training that they do, and what the weakest link in any of these programs, whether you're a museum or is always going to be, a mistake. And so, how good is your training on anti-phishing and whaling attempts and all of these things that are going on in these institutions, and how well is that enforced inside the institution? And we find generally that it's poorly enforced across the board institutionally. So this is an area that we encourage institutions to kind of pay more attention, work with their chief security officers, their security directors, work with outside firms to come in and help strengthen their security, their information infrastructure.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that planning is so critical anytime you're thinking about bringing a new system into your space. And then also in terms of how you're selecting your vendor partners, I know working with a software company like I do, one of our top priorities is making sure our customers are aware of these threats and that we offer services to help keep their systems updated so that they're not at risk. So anytime you're looking at vendor selection or a new system, have that conversation with them. How are we going to make sure this stays updated? Is there any additional cost associated with that I should be budgeting for? And what happens if there is a vulnerability identified in one of the components of the system? How does that get addressed? So that you have that full knowledge going in of, what it's going to take to maintain it long term.
Yeah. Carrie, you raised a couple of issues there. And I just want to, just kind of address really fast. And we see across the board is this, I'm going to term it victim mentality, right? So victim mentality, we see it a lot when we deal with crime victims, and whether that's an individual who's been the victim of a violent crime or a traumatic event. But this can happen institutionally as well, where museums or other institutions have this victim mentality. And what I mean by that is this sense of, well, that could never happen to me, right? That will never happen here. That is consistent across the board. And unfortunately, it's always wrong, right? And so this is how most victims become victims of violent crime or traumatic events, is not considering the fact that it might actually happen to them and having a plan for how to disengage from an event, if it's a personal attack, or how to prepare and defend against attacks on the institution. And so this is one of the things that we talk to our clients about pretty consistently, is changing that paradigm, shifting away from the victim mentality to a more proactive stance and protecting against these types of threats. And then the other issue that I really want to kind of floor stomp for everybody, and we see this just all of the time, is this concept of misplaced trust. Right. So you talked about vetting your vendors. It's critical that you understand your vendors and that you do consistent, periodic vetting of vendors. I have been to so many museums and talked to so many security directors, and we'll interview them about their processes related to catering, after hours events, their vendors, contractor staffs, and how many times I'm told, well, that conservationist has been here, they're on contract, or they've been in and out here for the last 20 years, so we don't badge them, we don't do anything. And, they don't apply periodic background investigations. They're not doing any of this work, and that's just called misplaced trust. And so to share with you all a statistic that we've often talked about over the years, that the FBI has collected this data for decades, 80% of all museum thefts in the United States are internal. And that means they're carried out by internal staff someone in a position of trust, whether it's an employee, a contractor, or somebody else that has trusted access to the facility. And so they just kind of forced on what you're talking about there, Carrie, about, it's critical to vet those vendors properly and understand who you're working with.
Absolutely. I'm never happier than when I visit a new museum for the first time. They search my bag on the way in and the way out and make sure that I haven't brought anything in I'm not supposed to, and also that I'm not taking anything out that I'm not supposed to. It's a simple step, but it can make a huge difference. And if you apply it equally across your staff, there might be some ruffled feathers up front where people are saying, oh, do you not trust me? But eventually it becomes routine and the expectation, and then people know not to try to sneak stuff out in their purse. We're going to shift away from European incidents really quickly to jump back over stateside and talk about this incident from March of this year at the Seattle Center's Chihuly Garden and Glass Museum. And the reason I bring this up is because we want to talk a little bit about balancing public access to objects that can be very fragile and sensitive. And obviously glass is a great example of this because it is incredibly breakable. And Chihuly sculptures oftentimes, cannot be encased. They're large in size. They need to interact with the environment they're placed in. So we see, especially with spaces that hold these types of collections, a real challenge that they're facing of trying to protect those fragile pieces from damage like this, where I do believe this was an after hours event, if I'm remembering it correctly, that someone came in after hours into this kind of courtyard space and just started intentionally damaging this one sculptural piece and caused about $200,000 worth of damage in just a few minutes. Yeah. And luckily they did have security systems in place where they were able to identify who did it, and apprehend them, but the damage was still done and the museum is still stuck footing that bill at the end of the day. And so thinking a little bit about, how do we help mitigate those concerns when we know we're putting collections out there that are sensitive or fragile?
Yeah, this is one of those really difficult incidents. This is just a tragedy because this is quite difficult to protect against and to guard against this type of activity. This gentleman almost certainly had some mental health issues. He was quite violent. He tried to stab one of the guards, with a shard of the glass from the broken sculptures. And then ultimately, I think the police had to tase him, if my memory's right on this. So clearly, there were some mental health issues going on and some violence issues. And so, very difficult to defend against. I'm not sure that anybody would, we certainly wouldn't recommend, physical altercation to protect cultural heritage. As important as it is, your life and safety are much more important. So this is one of those that's really difficult. It's just a tragic event. Technology can help if you have those edge analytics on your cameras that can alert you to a presence. That way you can at least get some security response and get law enforcement on the way, right? Time is critical. Seconds count in these types of events. So they did everything correct because they got that law enforcement response immediately and had police arriving on site to deal with this violent subject. But this is one of those that's going to be difficult to guard against.
Yeah, and unfortunately there are those out there. We're doing risk mitigation, but we've said it several times throughout this presentation. We'll say it again. There's no 100% way to protect against everything everywhere all the time, which is why it's so important to understand your overall risk profile and focus on where you can target those efforts. If you have these types of pieces in your collection, that's something that you do need to be thinking about. Jumping back to Europe, because we weren't gone long, March was a pretty rough month for art crime this year. And this incident was interesting to me because it felt almost like a mirror of what had happened at the Louvre just a few months prior. And to Tim's point, and not to accuse the Magnani Rocca Foundation of not doing their due diligence, because I think they were in the progress of a security system update when this happened, but there was a tendency to, the Louvre happened, we all poked our heads up on high alert and then went back to business as usual. And crimes have continued to happen, and that is going to continue to happen, and we do need to be aware of that. So in this incident, again, middle of the day, people walked in, they took works by Renoir, Matisse, and Cézanne, and I believe 3 is the magic number. I think it was about 3 minutes that they were in and out. The alarm did sound, and there was a response. It just wasn't fast enough to get them before they made off with the art. Tim, what do you think about this one?
Yeah, I think this is a typical European heist. We've seen this repeat itself time and again all throughout Europe for really the last 20 years. We could point to quite a few examples that look almost carbon copied of this heist. Clearly, this was a highly organized crew. They had done their homework. They likely have carried out similar heists in the past. So this one was well executed. Yeah, they dropped a painting. They made a mistake. They dropped one. I think the alarms triggered. They had a 4th painting. They didn't get out with that. And so, um, again, it's to the point that you said, Carrie, can you prevent every one of these incidents? Not really, right? You can't prevent every crime from happening, particularly when you have dedicated, educated, committed, organized crime crews that are executing these heists. But security is about layers. So one of the things that museums sometimes do poorly is thinking about placement of valuable artworks. And so if you're an organized crime group and you're targeting artworks, you're likely going to target those household name artists. Again, it's not Thomas Crown Affair. They're not eccentric billionaire art collectors. These guys are thieves. They steal artwork to monetize that commodity, right? And so in the mind of a thief, if I can steal a Cezanne or I steal a Monet or a Van Gogh, that's worth much more money. Of course, it doesn't really occur to them. It's much more difficult to move that into the market. But we don't see them necessarily targeting low value works. And yet we go into institutions and those high value household name artists might be on the perimeter. It might be close to exit doors and things like that. So we want to come in and have those discussions when they're doing planning, exhibition planning about placement. And so there are things that you can do beyond technology, just in placement of your collection to create those layers and make it more difficult for the thieves to be able to get access to those valuable artworks they caught with them.
Again, folks, we are here to give you free tips. Move things away from the door.
Get them away
It
from
might
the door.
seem like common sense, but those are oftentimes the pieces we're really proud of and we want to show off, and that can lead to an unexpected vulnerability.
It does happen. Unfortunately, it happens frequently. We went to an institution last year, did an assessment. I, of course, won't name them, but they had $60 million in household name artists in a gallery with no camera coverage and an unalarmed exit door to the parking lot. No security hangers. And so these are preventable and easily addressed low-cost measures that every museum can implement to better secure those pieces. And that you have those conversations, well, why these artworks in this gallery? If you have a security gap in this gallery, isn't it more sensible to move lower value, less important works into that space and bring your high value, more important works deeper into the facility just to make it more difficult? So there are strategies that you can implement that are low cost and effective, make it harder for these crews to get access to your collections.
Absolutely. And, I know a lot of places are probably already doing this, but just to say, if you're not already involving security in those initial exhibit planning conversations, that's something that you can do tomorrow to start making some of these changes. We have one more example, and then we're going to open the floor for questions, but I do want to make sure we get to this one because we've talked a lot about art crime, and these types of incidents don't only happen in art museums. And I hope we have folks here today who don't work in art museums. So this incident took place again in March of 2026, a bad month, at the Ancient Ozarks Natural History Museum, when visitors during the museum's open hours in the middle of the day decided to try to hang from these mammoth tusks and ended up damaging, this completely irreplaceable, priceless ancient fossil that was one of the museum's centerpieces. And so, Tim, I guess my question for you here is kind of, how often do you see this happening in non-art museums? And do you feel like there's any sort of trends there between, like, are they more damage incidents, theft incidents? What are the things we need to be flagging for our non-art museum friends?
Great question. I think it doesn't really matter. We see these types of events at fine art museums, historical museums, anthropological. It doesn't matter, you know. Um, this clearly, I think it was an intentional act, of course, but they didn't intend for the damage to occur. This is just, they're wearing their dunce caps here, I think we would say, right? This is, but we see these events frequently, right? We can point to the Terracotta Warrior incident at the Franklin Institute was tragic. There's been a number of these over the years where people go in and just kind of do dumb things. Um, but again, the trend, right? The theme that runs through all of these examples that we're giving that connects them all is they're preventable. Just by executing proper policy and having the proper security policies in place, reliance on technology, but reliance, I think technology is important, but I think just as important is developing the proper concierge style security posture at your institution. Instead of security being heavy-handed and observational and putting people at off balance and unease. We like to see instead those concierge style security programs where the security are actively involved with the visitors. They're helpful and they engage in conversations. And that's when we think visitors are going to be less prone to some of this kind of irresponsible behavior that they demonstrate around collections. So this incident too was preventable.
Yeah, and I think that's been our through line for out. So we will end on that note, and I'll take down the slides so we can all see each other. Thank you again so much, everyone, for being here today. We have a few minutes left for questions, but if you don't get a chance to ask your question today, Heather will be sharing our contact information. Please feel free to contact me or Tim anytime and come say hi in person at SEMC. I'll be there in the exhibit hall in Winston-Salem. So Heather, anything that popped up in the chat while we were talking?
Yeah, we did have a couple of questions come up. I know one person just wanted to, Catherine wanted to know the statistics that 80% of things that happen are internal in your organization. She wondered where that statistic come from.
Sure. That comes from the FBI and the FBI's National Stolen Art File. So since about 1970, the FBI has been collecting data on museum thefts. Well, thefts of all artwork in the United States. So if the police report, it's a bit like NCIC, if you will, or the Uniform Crime Reports that some of you may have heard about. The FBI collects all of this data annually. And so we do have a subset of that data that's specific to artwork. And we, for decades, have examined that annually and looked at reported thefts at museums. And so the statistics have been pretty clear and haven't really changed much in the last 40 or 50 years. And it's 80% of all thefts from museum or institutional space are internal thefts. Again, whether they're carried out by an employee, a staff member, contractors, vendors, people with a position of trust that have access to the space. And interestingly, if I were to ask most of you about your institutions, where's the majority of your security apparatus pointed, you're probably going to tell me that it's pointed at your gallery and common spaces, which is what we tend to see. And then I'm going to point out to you that not only is 80% of all theft internal theft, but 80% of all of that theft occurs in your collection storage space and not in your gallery spaces. And so this is part of that conversation about understanding where your threats actually lie as an institution and applying your security posture to address those specific threats. It's a complicated environment. You have all kinds of issues to consider related to security. It's not just theft. It's, again, unwanted touches, vandalism, accidental damage, slip and falls, domestic violence, and the list goes on and on and on that you've got to deal with within your institutional space, but related specifically to thefts. Most of your museums, you're getting burned in your collection storage space.
Now, is this data public? Can the
It's
attendees go to?
it is not public,
Okay,
so unfortunately, no.
okay. But you heard it here today, so now you know.
I
Another
did.
question comes from Todd. He says, I would like to hear more about the AI analytic tools you mentioned for CCTV monitoring and alerting human security. Can this be added to existing IP camera systems or does it require new hardware? Great question.
Yeah, I can field that one first and then hand it over to Tim to add. Just speaking for ArtSentry and our software, it can absolutely be added to your existing IP cameras. Oftentimes, where we see the need to add new hardware is going to be where there's coverage gaps for what you're trying to accomplish with those analytics. Cameras are only good as the views they have. So when it comes to adding new hardware, that's usually where that piece comes in. But the software itself is compatible with your IP cameras and some analog cameras too. So, Tim, anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, no, that's it. We some analytics can be network analytics, right? They live on the server side of things. Most of the analytics that we like these days are what we call these edge analytics that live on the cameras. And so, as Carrie explained, they're usually compatible with most modern systems, particularly if you're using IP cameras. Um, I'm a little less knowledgeable about the analog. So if you've got analog cameras with converters, I think some systems might do that, but that gets a bit gray in that area. And it's surprising how many institutions are still running analog systems and VVR and NVR systems. But I think most institutions are in that process of trying to upgrade and get onto IP platforms. So.
Yeah,
Great.
we see that as well.
Awesome. Let's see. Another question from Vanessa. What are the statistics regarding destruction of African American collections, referencing the May 21st incident at the Houston Museum of African American Culture, where a man put a blade through the man in the garden by Clarence Hayward. They didn't restore and hung it back up as a sign of education to make the wound visible. So any statistics regarding destruction of African American collections?
So I don't think anyone is collecting that data specifically related to African American collections. I'm not aware of this incident. It's disturbing, but not terribly surprising. Again, we see these types of incidents occur frequently. Again, vandalism and intentional destruction of artworks is unfortunately a common thing. And strangely, the federal laws on that are extraordinarily weak. This is the type of event where you would almost certainly have to rely on local and state law to intervene as opposed to federal law. So this is not really the kind of incident, even where the FBI art crime team would be involved, other than in an advisory capacity, which they would always be willing to do to come in and work with local law enforcement to kind of give them their expertise and guidance. But no, I don't. The short answer is I'm not sure about the statistics. That would be work that would have to be done to compile that.
Yeah, and I don't have statistics either, but I will say I was familiar with this incident, incredibly upsetting. And I liked the museum's decision for two reasons. One, because, as Vanessa said, it did make the wound to that particular piece visible to future visitors to understand that these, types of incidents can unfairly target African American collections or collections associated with other minority or oppressed groups. It also made it public in the museum sector that these types of incidents are happening and we don't have to cover them up, because I think that's one of the biggest issues when it comes to art crime statistics. And the reason why we don't have all of these numbers handy is because museums do historically try to cover incidents up as much as possible. They don't want to damage institutional trust, public trust in their institution. And that's understandable. But if we're not talking about it, we don't really understand the full scope of the situation. And that is in and of itself an additional threat. So if you're the Louvre and you get robbed in broad daylight, everyone's going to find out about it. But a lot of these incidents fly under the radar, and that's detrimental to us learning from them.
Thanks. Anyone else, feel free to unmute and ask your question in person or share in the chat. While people are typing or thinking of a question, I have one question. So a lot of our museums are smaller organizations, and I know we've mentioned risk profiles and security, concierge security and things like that. What advice would you give to smaller organizations who perhaps don't have the resources to have an in-depth security team or systems, or so what would you suggest that they do?
Effective cross training. So, it's the old adage, right? An ounce of prevention and a pound of cure kind of thing, right? So oftentimes we see the small institutions that don't have the budgets and they don't have the training and the staffing tend to, I won't say ignore security, but they certainly don't prioritize it. Look, here's the reality, guys. I look at security in museums. That's what I do. I'm an art crime investigator. I'm who you call when you've had a problem, and my job is to come in and solve that problem for you and try to recover your possessions. So we certainly look at things from that lens. But what sets us apart from a traditional security company, of course, is we do art crime investigations. We've lived in the museum space for decades. We understand museum operations. Traditional security companies understand security, but they may not understand museum operations. And I think it's really important to know the blend because there are a lot of challenges, whether it's a historic building that you can't just run drops here and there and put conduit in. Don't let me get too far off topic, but effective cross training. What we would say is, a museum's mission is to be open and inviting to the public to let people have that experience. And we too want that experience with the collection. So we're not suggesting that security has to become your priority. What we would suggest is it should at least get equal weight. So we want effective cross training in your programs. So your visitor management staff should have some level of effective security, concierge style security training, some security awareness training. They don't need to be armed guards. We're not suggesting they have to intervene, and that's what you have local law enforcement for. And again, you should have those relationships built in place. You should practice those relationships. One of the things that I like to talk about is bring in an outside firm, work with your local law enforcement agencies, work with the FBI, do tabletop exercises to stress test your vulnerabilities from a security perspective, then move from a tabletop to an actual FTX, so a field training exercise, as we would have said in the FBI, but a practical exercise where you test your vulnerabilities. And only then will you truly know where those issues lie. And then you can develop plans to fix them.
I know that's bringing us to the end of our time, Heather, so I'll just add very briefly that ArtSentry puts out a free museum grant guide every year for capital improvement grants. So if anyone's struggling with that particular issue of funding right now and wants that free resource, let me know. I'm happy to share it. And I see Larry's question about uniforms for security personnel, which we don't have time to talk about right now, but I would love to address in a future session. And of course, Larry, you've got my number. Anytime you want to talk about that, let me know.
That's perfect. Well, yeah, we are approaching the hour, and I really appreciate this topic. Again, as Zinnia mentioned earlier, I think this is something we don't talk about enough. And Zinnia, if you have any parting words or advice or anything, let us know.
This was great. I mean, prior to my role here, I spent 20 years in an art museum working in collections and exhibitions and operations, and then eventually security. So it's nice to hear how far things have come, but then some of the problems are still there. I think if we do a part 2 of this session, which I'm sort of advocating for in my head right now, so hopefully, one thing we didn't talk about, which I think would probably be helpful, not everyone uses fine art shipping. Like to move their collections from space to space or organization to organization even, or across town. So it might be good next time to also talk about just some baseline best practices when thinking through security of moving your collections internally and outside the space. I mean, I can think of a few off the top of my head, but we'll leave everyone waiting for part two. Thank you both. That was really good.
Sounds great.
Yeah, awesome. So I will share the recording with everyone. And again, we'll share Carrie and Tim's information when in that follow-up email. So if you have any other questions or think of anything after we end today, you will have that contact information and you will be able to reference the recording today. So many thanks to each of you for taking time out of your day to join us for this really important program. Stay tuned for part two. Carrie, you and I will talk about that and go out and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you for joining SEMC.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
everyone. Bye.